My name is Devon, welcome to my YouTube channel. This video will be the second episode of a mini-series on vocal horsepower, a type of opera singing I introduced in my earlier video. In my earlier video, I described vocal horsepower as the sensation of a singer using their voice to create shockwaves that leave a lasting ring in their aftermath, but not before punching a hole right through to the listener's heart. I also described how vocal horsepower produces sounds which go high up into the atmosphere, generating electric currents which surge through the human body and are causing a massive infusion of adrenaline into the bloodstream. Afterwards, we had the chance to sample these sensations through a few examples I selected. The next question you might ask is this: who the hell in his right mind will subject himself to more of that? You'll be surprised how many in our community would. The operas with a reputation for having the best opportunities for their performers to showcase their penetrative power lie at the heart of the international operatic repertoire. The singers with abundant vocal horsepower to draw on, the dramatic singers, are the ones able to perform them to maximum advantage. Operas where the dramatic singers can most commonly be found will be referred to accordingly as operas in the dramatic category. Should you come across books on opera, you'll find that the weight categories I mentioned in the previous episode are used to classify roles rather than works. The books are correct. It's just that I'm choosing to borrow the weight categories for my classification of works in order to make this more manageable for newcomers. Most of the operas in the dramatic category are from the 1860s to the early 20th century. Despite the fact that changing musical fashions and tastes did bring about an evolution in the international operatic repertoire, these operas have become permanent fixtures in the schedules of opera houses worldwide. Their places in the repertoire are as immovable as the mountains of the Himalayas, commanding a following on the scale of the multitudes which flock to attempt conquering these mountains every year. If they aren't as frequently staged today as in the past, it's only because we don't have as many singers with the requisite amount of vocal horsepower now. A big reason why the operas in the dramatic category continue to be so popular despite the present shortage of vocal talent is because of the sensation of vocal horsepower. That experience is not something you can find that easily elsewhere. Remember when I used the analogy of a combat sport in explaining how operas have weight categories? Such an analogy cannot be more apt. Especially when the Italian operas in the dramatic category, the operas which I'll be covering in this part, have a reputation of being the combat sports of the operatic if not classical or musical world. Do you recall the jackhammer capable of producing shockwaves which I used to describe the voice of a dramatic singer? Doesn't it make the dramatic singers seem like superhumans? It's the chance to bear witness to these superhumans in action which gives the operas in the dramatic category their lasting popularity. To give you an example of how does that work, I'll be using the Italian operas in the dramatic category because they are the most popular and accessible of the lot. Italian opera, particularly from the period between the 1860s to the early 20th century, the age of vocal horsepower is like a hothouse. Listening to or watching any one of these operas, assuming that they are sung properly, is as good as witnessing the shooting of an action movie firsthand. Everything in these operas is done to extremes. The lead couple are being consumed by their overwhelming feelings about one another. In most cases, they love each other to death. Like any romance movie, there's always at least one person who just has to stand in the way of them being together. To make things easier, let's call this person the rival. This rival is usually the baritone, but from time to time, you have a mezzo-soprano playing this role. The rival is the predator lurking in the shadows, ever ready to pounce on either one of the lead couple when he or she detects an opportunity. When he or she does, that's when the combat breaks out in the performance. You have the rival pitting his or her voice against the voice of the male lead tenor or the female lead soprano. They come to vocal blows, releasing sparks when they clash. All this while, as if in a hothouse, the composer has been keeping the temperature of the drama high. As the show goes on, the drama's temperature inches toward the point when things get white hot. Previously, I mentioned that singers' voices have weight categories. In an Italian opera in the dramatic category, most of the singers involved at least will be in the heaviest weight category, the dramatic category. You have dramatic tenors, dramatic sopranos, dramatic baritones, and dramatic mezzo-sopranos, the superhumans. Most of us have watched at least one superhero movie before, DC or Marvel. We all know superheroes and superheroines do everything to galactic proportions. Similarly, when you've got superhumans playing the lead couple and or the rivals, their vocal horsepower multiplies the impact of every moment in the opera, love scene or combat scene by a scale factor of at least 5 or even more. If this is hard to imagine, I'll elaborate further. In an Italian opera in the lyric category, the lightest weight category, a love scene performed at its best will melt hearts. In an Italian opera in the dramatic category, the same scene won't stop at melting hearts. You also feel as though the earth is shaking under your feet. For a moment, doubts about the safety of the place you're in begin to creep into your mind out of nowhere. What about the combat scenes? Even better. During the combat scenes in the Italian operas in the lyric category, while the singers contend with one another, you feel that the air around them starts to crackle and sizzle. As the combat scenes progress, the singers load charge onto charge into the air. Once the combat scenes reach the end, the air is so overly charged that it goes off, causing an explosion which triggers a burst of applause from the audience upon their fiery finales. Italian operas in the dramatic category take things even further. While the singers bring their voices down on each other, they don't just heat up the surroundings. Cracks also appear in the ground under them. Towards the conclusion of the confrontations between or among these singers, it seems as though the earth can barely contain the presence of these superhumans. Why is there such a vast difference between the Italian operas in the lyric and those in the dramatic category? It's the vocal horsepower of the singers in the Italian operas under the dramatic category which makes the difference. It gives those operas their potency. The potency of the Italian operas under the dramatic category alone will be sufficient to assure their enduring success. Doesn't my description of vocal horsepower make opera possible to enjoy? It becomes a guilty pleasure when you read some of the writings of the Anglo-American critics and reviewers whose opinions shape the musical taste and preferences of the people in our community, especially in the English-speaking world. According to these writings, vocal horsepower is an approach to opera which leads to several bad habits that detract from the virtues of the masterpieces. To be fair, vocal horsepower does lead to some excesses. Even the greatest practitioners, whom we shall hear later, are not immune from them. There are the incidents when some singers, notoriously tenors, suspend their high notes for too long to milk the audience of applause for all it's worth. There are also the incidents when the robust singing of certain singers with full-bodied voices is perceived as being rough, unimaginative, and ham-fisted. In other words, they give the impression of bashing their way through. They seem to sing everything in one heated, forceful voice, even during sentimental moments where perhaps a soft, tender approach might be more appropriate. There are a number of performances which I later found to be extraordinary that have become consigned to the dust heap because of all these incidents. So, is vocal horsepower necessarily a vice? Through expressing their disapproval, the critics and reviewers are only acting out of a concern that singers unfaithfully observing the musical and dramatic intentions of the composers who wrote the various operas they are performing in. Fair enough, but there's one thing which they've overlooked. During the era of vocal horsepower, opera was very much a living art. The Italian operas at that time were like the Broadway and West End musicals of today. Opera was a lofty art form, but it was also popular entertainment. The composers undoubtedly had their eye on the box office when they were creating their masterpieces. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so generous with the high notes, whose sole purpose is to pay tribute to vocal athleticism. We are frankly no different from the masses who crowded the premieres of those works. Stunts and action lure us to the movies just like how they drew those people to the opera house. There's nothing wrong with indulging singers who allow themselves to get carried away in the spur of the moment with their seemingly interminable high notes. We all are children at heart. Why spoil everybody's fun by pooping their party if they're only playing to us in the galleries? And as for the uniform, vehement singing the critics and reviewers disapprove of, this is my view. This type of singing gives the impression of action and intensity. I don't know about the Italians, but I believe it has that effect on the majority of us who wouldn't know the language. The first time we listen to it, it takes on this compelling, rousing, invigorating quality. It truly livens up the dramatic Italian operas. It really sweeps us off our feet. Yes, I know very well that there's a lot more to these operas than pure vocal horsepower. There are also the other things called style, nuance, and lyricism, the soft tender approach I raised before this. Those are what the jaded critics and reviewers prize more, but let me be honest. I was in your shoes many years ago when I was learning how to enjoy those operas. Style, nuance, lyricism, and so on are the final qualities in the dramatic Italian opera. They are an acquired taste, something more advanced, which you normally acquire only after multiple listenings. Now, here's the thing. The critics and reviewers are well able to discern those other things after listening umpteen times. On the contrary, you're listening for the first few times. If the sound of the music doesn't even appeal to you, you definitely wouldn't bother with style, nuance, lyricism, and all the other attachments the critics and reviewers care so much about. This is why I strongly advocate, as I was taught many years ago, that when you explore the dramatic Italian operas, you subject yourself to a titanic frontal bombardment of vocal horsepower for knocking down the walls of your heart first. I recommend that instead of the balanced, moderate, authentic, sometimes mellowed versions the critics and reviewers promote. My rationale is this. An opening has to be carved out for the music to be able to work its magic. Believe me, when the music has secured its grip, which is bound to happen sooner or later, the attachments will fill that opening in due course. I'm aware what I'm saying is quite controversial, but let's see if I'm right after you've experienced a compelling, rousing, and invigorating bombardment of vocal horsepower. My ardent championing of concentrated vocal horsepower is not the only bombshell I'm going to drop off. It's only fitting that I drop another bombshell to round out this presentation on the delight of vocal horsepower. This other bombshell is my personal opinion on this subject. Vocal horsepower indeed does give me significant pleasure for the reasons I've just provided. There's also another reason why I love it a lot. That's because of the dramatic tenor or the tenore di forza, whom I think stands at the summit of manhood. For me, there's no sound manlier than the brilliant clarion sound produced by a dramatic tenor. In addition, his ability to emit it in the form of a sonic blast which he persistently fires over an orchestra that's ever threatening to drown it in its own flood of sound has always been one of the most impressive feats of virility to me. I'm not ashamed to admit I'm in love with the sound of a dramatic tenor, but my love doesn't stop there. Most of the operas in the dramatic tenor's repertoire are battleship class in terms of dramatic power. As the centerpieces of these operas, a large proportion of their drama rests on the dramatic tenor's shoulders. You can imagine how much expressive power their voices possess if the composers chose to assign them such responsibility. As I mentioned before, opera is drama set to music. The dramatic tenors are naturally poignant in their showpiece arias, but their fullest powers can only be released in a complete performance, if not scenes and or ensembles at least. These powers are so immense that they need a catalyst. This catalyst comes in the form of the other members of the cast, whose singing complements or even enhances that of the dramatic tenor. A dramatic tenor who utterly dominates his female partner doesn't deserve the acclamation awarded to heroes. That acclamation is only reserved for a dramatic tenor who prevails over a female partner with the vocal resources to stand up to him. A hero also can't be a real hero unless he has some formidable obstacle to overcome. Therefore, I do admire a dramatic baritone or mezzo-soprano who wouldn't go down unless he or she has had a brutal fight with the dramatic tenor, as either of them bars his path to his female partner. Over the next few episodes, we'll get the opportunity to experience the prowess of some of these legends. If you had fun watching this video, please help me like it. If you'd like to continue chasing this series, please subscribe to my channel. If you wish to express your views about it or discuss it further, please feel free to leave a comment. Thank you, and stay tuned.